I'd like to introduce our first panelist. Our first panelist is Dr. Sandra Davidson, was appointed Dean of the University of Calgary Faculty of Nursing in 2018 and is acknowledged as a Canadian nurse leader in entrepreneurial thought and creative innovation. Sandra also teaches leadership in the graduate program certificate, as well as conducts research in the area of teaching, learning, and simulation. I know I've chatted with Sandra over the years multiple times on mental health and well-being. I know she's a big supporter of this within the university and within her faculty. So let's welcome Sandra. I'll hand it over to you for your presentation.
All right. Well, thank you so much, Andrew. It's a pleasure to be here. And what a great way to wrap up the summer as we transition into fall, is having this kind of a conversation. So I don't have any slides. I am just going to chat, and I have some of my thoughts around well-being and some of the highlighting some of the things that we're doing in nursing. But I want to start with a little bit of a personal story that kind of frames why I have passion and why this work in embedding well-being into our organizational cultures is so important. So as in my 25 plus years as a nurse and as a leader in many different organizations, I've had the pleasure of being on some absolutely amazing teams. And when I think of those amazing experiences, the secret sauce that makes the team so impactful and memorable, even 25 years later, is the personal connections, the way that the team, had each other's back, and that we really, of course, there my phone rings. Isn't that just the way it goes? Yes, and just, that sense of connection that you never felt as in the weeds as you might have been, and overwhelmed with work. And in healthcare, that can happen quite easily. You always felt like there was somebody there, that you weren't in it alone. You had that support network. And I think that's really important to acknowledge. On the other side, I've been a part of organizations where it has felt exactly the opposite, that even though you might be on a team, you feel very isolated. You feel that you don't have that network to reach out to. You're in essence kind of suffering in silence, and you feel, oh my gosh, is it just me? As a matter of fact, that have been actually quite toxic and not healthy. That sometimes we learn the most in our careers by examples of what not to do. And, that's how I've made meaning out of those negative experiences, is challenging myself to make sure that I'm not emulating those kinds of things that don't help us lift us all up. So I was part that the toxic team that I'm talking about it's not UCalgary. I just want to say that in case your mind is going there. This was an organization in the United States. It was an academic post-secondary institution that I ended up leaving. And again, very isolating in a senior leadership position. And it was this weird juxtaposition of working with a toxic leader, but trying to protect my team from that toxicity and the stress that ensued because of that. And I was in that position for about 2 years. And one day, the critical point, and this will lead me to the rest of my remarks, I came home one day and I was just exhausted. And of course, my husband has been had a front row seat to this over the past 2 years in my work experience, because our lives don't have barriers. We bring stuff home, and stuff we have at home goes to work. We are whole people, and we can't bracket that out no matter how much we convince ourselves we can. And I was talking to him about something and about my sense of wanting to leave the organization, but not knowing where I was going to go next. And I remember we were standing in the kitchen, and he said to me, Sandra, I don't care if you don't know what your next step is. I don't care where we go. I just want my wife back. And it was in that moment that it was just like, wow, life is too short. So that was kind of the impetus for us leaving the US and coming back to Canada. I had a very happy landing place at the University of Alberta for 5 years before I came to UCalgary. And, honestly, it took me about 6 months, professionally and personally, just to recoup the energy that I had lost from living in that kind of very stressful, toxic environment. And as I was thinking about this talk, I was reading one of my favorite books, and this is a one that I would highly recommend to any leaders or aspiring leaders, or just anyone basically that's in organizations. It's Sean Acor's book, Big Potential, and some of you have probably heard me talk about it before. But within the book, there's a quote from the head of the American Institute of Stress. And it's strange that there is such an institute, but there's an Institute of Stress. And it really resonated with my experiences. The quote is, "Stress is a credit card for energy, and you're going to pay back, but with interest." So the more stress you have, it eventually catches up with you with interest. And that was what I was feeling that 6 months that it took me to recover from being out of that experience. So why is that meaningful? Because I think in roles as leaders, as senior leaders in organization, we are stewards of organizational culture. I mean, it's not us alone. We collectively, the system is all of us. Each and every one of us are part of the systems that we create and recreate every day. But within leadership positions, there's a certain level of visibility, and people are watching, and your mannerisms, your behavior, what you talk about, what you make time for signals what's important. And so I think as a leader, choosing to elevate the importance of mental health and wellness in very sometimes competitive organizations is a challenge. But, I'm a big fan and a steward and student of positive psychology and appreciative practices. And over, positive psychology has now, decades of research that supports some of these practices where, focusing on what's working gets you more of what's working. That's kind of the sentiment of appreciative practices and positive psychology is, not dismissing that there's mental illness and challenges that people have for a variety of reasons. But from an organizational perspective, focusing on what we can do to create a culture, a container to get more of positive relationships, positive outcomes, engagement, and connection, which leads to essentially joy at work. And, the opposite of joy is not kind of unhappiness. It's actually, as Sean Aker says, it's apathy. And that disengagement, which goes down that sucking negative spiral. If we're apathetic and we're disengaged, it means we're more isolated, and it just goes down that rabbit hole. Versus if we focus on practices that help us to be engaged and connected to our social networks and to those positive people in our constellation of relationships, that actually has a virtuous cycle that actually takes us all to a higher level. And so I think it's, in academia, we have so many bright, shining superstars amongst us. And sometimes it feels like an individualistic kind of mentality. But really what positive psychology is saying is if we work together and have those connections and build each other up, it's actually a team of superstars that actually is the sum is more than the whole is more than the sum of its parts, essentially. And there are habits and practices that we can integrate that allows us to create that kind of vibrant culture. And in nursing, the work is never done. I would say it needs to be recreated every day. As someone I once said, you can't take a shower once a year and expect to be clean all year. You have to do that every. Same sort of thing with some of these practices. The things we purposely did in the Faculty of Nursing is formally adopt and endorse the campus mental health strategy. And we developed a role with some resources behind that role as the director of mental health and wellness within nursing to kind of build that awareness and raise importance to the work of focusing on mental well-being. And now that position has been sunsetted, and we have actually a mental health and wellness committee that again brings together people that are interested, that are engaged in this work and want to continue to perpetuate this vibrant, healthy working environment. And so it's I think become a part of who we are. It's definitely embedded in our strategic plan, but a strategic plan is only as good as what you do with that every single day. If you build a strategic plan that says the words mental health and wellness, and then it sits on a shelf or in a PDF getting, no notice for 5 years, you're not going to get anywhere. It has to be, how do people take this up and make it their own and live it every single day? And as leaders, people are watching, and what we do matters. And so things in terms of little daily habits that I do, or yearly habits, is, when we're coming off summer, I went on vacation and I did not look at email for a week at a time. And, people are watching that. Oh, is she doing things on her vacation? Is she working? Is she sending me an email at 10 o'clock at night? Because then that signals that I have to be doing stuff at 10 o'clock at night. And so really being purposeful about modeling some of those best practices in terms of balance between work and rest time and the rest of your life, and allowing people to do the same. One of the things I remember early on, the university closes over the winter break, and we had our kind of going away, holiday party. And one thing I said is, you know what, the university is closed. Please don't send emails over the holidays unless it's an absolute emergency. And it was almost like this permission slip for people to actually disengage and not feel like they had to work through their holidays. And that was like 3.5 years ago. And people still bring that up as an example, and how powerful that was in terms of that, again, just permission to create a balance for themselves and really recharge. So I know I only have 10 minutes and I'm probably woefully over, but I have some other comments that I'm sure we'll weave into our discussion. But those are just kind of my high level remarks in the work that we're doing in nursing and my own personal journey.
Thank you, Sandra. And you talk about your story about emails and telling, giving permission to people not to send emails over the Christmas. And I talked to a faculty member in nursing, and the impact that they had that from your suggestion there, was so impactful for her. Right. Again, the modeling of these practices by the leader is such important. Thank you for highlighting that. So let's move on to our next presenter, Dr. Dianne Gereluk, the Dean and Professor at the Werklund School of Education. In her role as Dean, Dianne has renewed the school's commitment to championing all dimensions of child well-being, recently launching the Center for Wellbeing in Education. Welcome, Dianne.
So lovely to be here, Andrew, and thank you. And I'm really, I have to say, I'm so heartened to see so many participants here listening today, and hopefully learning and sharing amongst us in terms of how we can support each other towards collective well-being. I'm going to start with a little bit of a different emphasis than Sandra. And for Werklund School of Education, this has been a journey, I would say, over the last decade. And really primarily in terms of the informal ways that that well-being started to become part of the conversation and part of the culture and the ethos in the faculty, to where it became much more explicit and articulate in our policies and our programs and our practices and our strategic plan. In the early days, I think there was a sense, and it was hard to pinpoint, I think, amongst the faculty. There was 2 or 3 surveys that were done and consultations, but there was a sense of malaise or tensions in terms of the balance of work, just a sense of not thriving and flourishing in the context. And it was very difficult to articulate, but that also came up in our external unit review in 2017 in terms of something was amiss in terms of the culture and ethos within our faculty that I say there were health champions that started to push the leaders, including myself and many at the leadership table at that time, to start thinking about how do we make it explicit, not only in terms for our faculty and our staff in our program, but also in terms of the students that would become the future teachers, the future educational leaders, the future psychologists, and how would we those practices so that it wasn't just left to but really in terms of a collective responsibility towards well-being, and how do we model it within our own organizations so that it ripples into the broader educational and psychological landscape. Sasha, can you flip to the next slide, please? Thank you. One of the things, following that in 2017, we were the former dean and the leadership table, as a faculty, we came up, and one of the things that started to become attentive in response to those surveys was really trying to make explicit and articulate the commitment to personal wellness and collective well-being. And we saw that in our values, but we also saw it in our strategic pillar. And Sasha, if you want to flip it to the next slide. The collective well-being, we really started thinking about what were the different ways in which we think about the policies, the programs, and the practices. And what I want to do is just highlight some of the ways in which, there's been an evolutionary of thought within the faculty, knowing that collective well-being was actually a very contested term amongst the faculty because people didn't know how to define it. They didn't know how to articulate it. We had it on our faculty reports. People didn't know what they should highlight or report. Did it mean going for a walk? Did it mean that they had to embed it in their curricular practices? And so a lot of the conversations we're saying was the ambiguity about what collective well-being entailed. I actually think that was a highlight in terms of seeing the ways in which, how it emerged from the people, the emphasis that people brought in terms of the way in which they thought about well-being. But let's go to the next slide, and I'll try to talk through a few of some of the highlights that we've seen over the area. One of the key things, and it's, a real sense of pride, I would say, at Werklund School of Education, that we created a mandatory comprehensive school health course for all undergraduate students. This is the first of its kind in Canada, and to our knowledge, well, we haven't seen it anywhere else in the world. Normally, you would see this only for elementary students. In some cases, you would see it in the phys ed or, again, the health and wellness. But we made a commitment to the entire education program saying that this is something that is a precondition for learning, that if we don't have well-being amongst the teachers and the educators, if we don't create the conditions, then we're not going to get to the components of what does a flourishing learning environment entail. And I think that applies to post-secondary environments as well. We need to think of well-being as the precondition for learning. Well, and that's interesting because in any program and all the people that are attending here know that time is short, and every course there's always a vetting of which program, which course gets the compulsory element to the debate of others. And education has, a plethora of things. But there was a commitment in saying this would be something that we wanted to ensure that every single educator thought about it, thought about their informal practices, their pedagogy, the environment that they're creating, the inclusivity of the way in which they speak to create those conditions for a safe and learning environment. That has, spilled over, I think, in terms of the way, in terms of many of our certified teachers and our principals and our psychologists at the graduate who are already in the system or who are coming back. And some of our most popular programs now are really a sense of emphasis. So in our graduate programs, we have a lot of mindfulness and pedagogy, leading with heart, so that we think about that as a practice of what does good leadership look that has empathy and well-being embedded in it. Thinking from an Indigenous lens in terms of modeling reconciliation about how do we create it. And our support staff saying, oh, how do we create, there was a real element from our support staff saying, how do we build resilience through change? There's so much change management, and University of Calgary is, not without exception. We've seen significant internal challenges over the last few years with COVID and the budget, amongst all the different changes that we're doing. And the support staff are I always say, are the glue. They're our foundation. If we lose our support staff, then our support staff are really yearning, saying, how do we create that resilience and feel well given all this incredible change management? Next slide, please, Sasha. In terms of our policies, we started to think about how do we create this? Not only we wanted to include self-care, but start thinking about it in terms of the policies that we did. And I think this is an evolution that we're still working on. But in terms of creating an element for representation with our Indigenous Deans Advisory Circle, the creation of the Center for Wellbeing in Education is one that we've had a really strong clinic and integrated service in education, but we're really seeing the demand from our schools, our districts, the government, our external community agencies. And there's really been a heightened need need for kind of that wraparound holistic notion of well-being and going more upstream. So this is in response to seeing what the province is asking and demanding, and being attentive, particularly given the pandemic and the complexity of needs that are facing children, youth, and adults. Having more equitable and transparent work guidelines, it's always an element of a little bit of a conflation between workload and well-being, but there is a link between them. So what are the principles that guide the way in which workload is allocated? Is there a way in which that we're trying as best as possible, knowing that there's, parameters and limits, to think about how people are aligned as best as possible to the work that they're good at and that they excel at, and to make it explicit. So it's not just for those who know how to work the post-secondary system, but that everybody has an element saying, okay, here are the principles. We might not agree with them, but here they are, and we keep on returning back to those principles. Do they attend to it? So it's an attempt to honor the expertise and creating the work conditions so that people are excited to come to work and do the work that they excel at. Creating formal awards programs for sports staff, professional learning funds for our managers and our AUP staff, particularly when there's been hiring freezes. So how do we acknowledge the support, knowing that there were external constraints of which we couldn't, acknowledge the incredible work they were doing. And then increasingly what we're asking now is for people to, as part of their annual performance goals, is to have one well-being goal and really commit to it. What is it going to mean meaningful for them, so that they see that this is actually an important element of them to thrive in their work environment, is actually to come to work well. Next slide. The last one, I think, is the practices, formal and informal. Increasingly you're seeing across campus and different faculties and different units are starting to do it, but we have a wellness champions committee. Again, I have some incredible colleagues across our faculty who've really committed to it. And so you've started to see elements that have risen from the committee and from suggestions from students and staff and faculty, but profiling wellness so that we talk about what we do to fill our buckets up. We have a field self-care hashtag that is a commitment for all of our undergraduate students to do 15 minutes of self-care when they're in the field. And what's exciting about this one is that it's actually expanded nationally, and it's expanded beyond our undergraduate program. So what I love is seeing our leaders across campus who are following this field self-care street, saying for 15 minutes a day, this is what I commit to do. We have a campus wellness walk. So if you're around the Werklund building, there's little QR codes and there's scavenger hunts so that we try to encourage people to do for lunch. Similar to Sandra, the holidays and work-life balance, creating a tranquility space, particularly for support staff who don't have the element to be necessarily in their own offices. And then modeling just wellness practices. So those are some of the formal and informal. It's always interesting. You're never going to hit everyone's, they don't speak to everyone, but they don't necessarily have to. It's a range of activities that we hope that on balance that are going to help support people to see that wellness is something that we are committed to, and that we want to encourage as part of our collective responsibility. So last slide, it's just a picture. Oh yeah, okay, that's fine. Our strategic plan, we've committed to a collective responsibility towards healthy and flourishing environments. This is the National Day of Truth and Reconciliation. We had the time was 200 was the max. If you recall, last September in terms of outdoor gatherings, and I think we had 199. We didn't really cut; it was a rough count. Of our students and our staff and our faculty and community members started just joining us on Nose Hill and the Medicine Wheel. And so I think that those are illustrations and reflections of the commitment towards wellness that can align to other key strategic priorities within our institution. So I'll stop there and then take questions later.
Thank you, Dianne, for that. I loved all the things that you said, but I think some of the important things that I wanted to highlight from what you've said for policies and creating policies around well-being and things related to that is very important. I also liked, your explicit link between teaching and learning and well-being and integrating, that into teaching and learning. So I know that's was mentioned in the comments. And finally, I think I liked how you talked about it's a journey, right? You started this many years ago, and I can't emphasize on enough. It's not a one and done. It takes time to build this and to do this and get it embedded. So thank you for that, Dianne. And our final panelist today is Dr. Kimberly Johnston, the Associate Dean, Mental Wellness for the Schulich School of Engineering. Kim is focused on engineering, education, innovation, and advancing mental health during the engineering education process. Kim, over to you.
Thank you. And yeah, thank you to Sandra and Dianne. That was inspiring to hear what other faculties are doing as well. So yeah, my name is Kim. It's nice to meet everybody. I know a lot of names on here. So the Associate Dean Mental Wellness position is actually a brand new one. So I became the Associate Dean of Mental Wellness on July 1st of this year, which is a very exciting transition in Schulich School of Engineering. So I would say that for me, the mental well-being has actually been a really a personal passion project for about 3 or 4 years. And how it actually started, how it started for me was, in addition to my own personal journey, when I started teaching as an engineer, I started kind of informally surveying most of my friends and colleagues and saying, when we went through university, and after we went through university, what would you have changed? What worked for you in classrooms, what didn't work for you? And almost universally, the friends that I still have, the colleagues that I still have, said things like, I would have started meditating earlier, or I didn't actually realize how many little moments of trauma I had in university, and I would have gotten to therapy sooner. Or interestingly enough, nothing was about the way that we learned thermodynamics or heat transfer. Nobody 15 years after we got out of it, none of my colleagues said, I would have, I would have changed my study strategies, that type of thing. Actually, everybody commented on their personal journeys. So what that did for me was, a few years ago, just in hallway conversations with some other people who felt similarly passionate about mental well-being, was I started having a lot of conversations around what is it that we can do for our students to actually support the whole person going through engineering. So my teaching and learning philosophy started to shift from, what do I teach? I teach thermodynamics, to what do I teach? I teach students thermodynamics. And then it started to shift even further to, I start to teach students how to be entire people. That might include engineering. And then when I shifted into the leadership role as an associate dean, which is about 3.5 years ago, it started to shift into, how do I help influence culture to support students and faculty in becoming more holistic versions of themselves while they share engineering skills. So because of all of that, I think that might have been why I became the first Associate Dean Mental Wellness. But also, as the years have gone by, I've really truly seen a shift within Schulich School of Engineering, as well as the University of Calgary, as well as just the collective of humanity where I interact with people. And mental wellness has sort of, years ago, it started to come into the language. And maybe 5-10 years ago, in places I would have seen lip service coming to it. Yeah, it's important, but we don't know what to do, or it's important, but it's somebody else's job, or things like that. To recently, it really is a genuine importance, and it really is, how do we take the steps to shift the culture? And those steps are being taken. And I loved hearing Dianne and Sandra's talks, because some of those things are happening in Schulich as well. And we have mental wellness in our strategic plan, and we have strategic priorities, and we have performance metrics in Schulich School of Engineering around mental well-being for our staff and our students. And one of the like major steps was creating this position of Associate Dean Mental Wellness, which I don't know, hopefully that framing might indicate that I'm absolutely delighted to have that be part of my main role instead of just a passion project off the side of my desk. So that's a little bit about me and my role. And Sasha, if you want to go to the next slide. So we've done a variety of things in Schulich School of Engineering. What I'm going to talk about, I've got just a few slides here to talk about some of the big projects that I'm working on that I'm very excited about. But I wanted to start with some of the philosophy. So, you know, I'm an engineer. My background is engineering. I have a PhD in thermodynamics, which sort of like begs the question when we start to talk about this, especially in engineering, is, are we qualified to talk about this? And so I did want to sort of say a little bit about the philosophy of what our wellness programming is, which is, it's more like I'm not inventing wellness practices, but I as a person have gone through some of my own struggles with stress management and some of my own struggles with like, how do I move through some of the big challenges in my life? How do I learn how to thrive instead of being in sort of some like dark suffering places? And we know, especially with the campus mental health strategy, there are a lot of fantastic resources. There are a lot of well-studied practices that are going to support our students. There are a lot of beautiful, beautiful things that we can bring to our students, but we also know that our students aren't always utilizing them. So really the philosophy is to like connect practices and resources and helpful things to our students in times when they need them. So a lot of what we're doing is repackaging existing material, where we're bringing into classroom strategies and resources that students might otherwise have to go seek out, and they might not ever seek out. Some of the programming, some of what you'll hear too, is we've done things like classroom visits, and we've had some like peer, we use this peer model of education. So in some of our classroom visits, we actually have upper year students coming in to first year classes, sharing stories, talking to each other about what it is that they're going through. So what we're trying to do in this culture shift, is to highlight that professors, staff, students, all of us are going through some challenges and sharing some tools and strategies with each other to try and create a culture where we can normalize some conversations that 10 years ago might not have been happening. Again, a really big highlight here on this final gear is that what we're trying to do is raise awareness around mental well-being topics, as opposed to bringing to the classroom things like crisis counseling. So Sasha, if you want to go over to the next slide. One of the big projects is our wellness room. So we actually now have a dedicated space in Schulich School of Engineering. As we all know, the past few years have been fairly disrupted with COVID. So the wellness room kind of came into being just before COVID, but all of these last 2 years have been quite disrupted. So we're really excited to get rolling with this again this year. But it's a dedicated space where we have well-being programming, and the space is in the engineering building. It's right beside the atrium. So in our engineering building, we have this big open space that has things like ping pong tables for the students. And then in this room, we have a variety of well-being supports, including kind of drop-in wellness classes, meditation classes. We bring puppies in every now and then for the students to touch and cuddle and have those positive vibes every now and then in the days. So you can click over to the next slide, Sasha. Another program that we're running that I'm really happy about is our first year curriculum programming. So for about the past 3 years, we've actually been bringing well-being and learning strategy modules into the first year curriculum. The structure of them is, it's sort of varied over the past few years because of course delivery varying. But it's a bringing of information around resources that exist on campus, a variety of little strategies. You know, we tell them some of the research around meditation and why it helps. And then in the classroom, we teach them some grounding techniques. We get them to do some grounding techniques, and we get them to do square breathing or triangle breathing for a little bit. So we kind of like bring those in and actually put them right in front of students. Like I say, we've delivered it a handful of different ways. We did classroom visits. Last year, we actually transitioned to a weekly or bi-weekly seminar requirement. A student actually shared this meme. One of the first year engineering students put this together and posted it on their social media. I'm not actually on social media, so somebody else ended up sending this to me, and it just absolutely warmed my heart. The first year students putting this meme together about how they feel after the well-being seminar. We get the students to do some reflections around self-care, for instance. And I've spent some time going through and reading all of those reflections. Some of the biggest shifts that have happened over the past few years is this sentiment that we overwhelmingly hear from the students, that is, it feels like you care. So the feeling of actually, whether or not we're giving them the exact right tool, like not every single student resonates with the exact material that we can give them every single week. But the overall sentiment that we keep hearing is that it's nice to come into university and not feel like a nameless number, but to feel like part of a community, to feel like the professors, to feel like the upper year students, to feel like the community cares about the students, which is just a delight. You can pop over to the next slide there, Sasha. And then this is another one that we're going to get going on this year. We have approval for this co-curricular certificate in personal and community well-being. So at Schulich, we obviously, like the students, have degree requirements, and we have a variety of co-curricular certificates. We have one that students really quite enjoy called a leadership program. So we've got this variety of co-curricular experiences, and we've just developed this one in personal and community well-being. So you can see a little bit of the overall structure. We haven't actually implemented it yet, so it might modify, but basically going through like 4 tiers. They'll get badges for each tier that they can put onto their LinkedIns. But going through as a cohort, when the students sign up for this co-curricular certificate, going through the cohort and going through and doing some seminars, some workshops, some personal reflections, going through some experiences with each other around their own personal journey and around developing and practicing tools to support each other when they're going through that sort of challenging, or the university experience that at times can be challenging, the human experience that can at times be challenging. I believe that is all that I had for slides. Yeah, and I'll pass it back over to Andrew. Thank you.
Thank you, Kim, for that. And you know, I really appreciate all the great things that you're doing within Schulich. But again, I just want to stress, you know, your position, you know, besides deans of teaching and learning or professional development or academic programs, you know, you have your specific, you know, associate dean of mental well-being, right, or mental wellness, right? That says so much to everybody, right, to the students, to the faculty and staff, that this is a priority. So I really appreciate that. So before we get into our question and answer from the audience, and please do start typing some questions in there. I want to just, you know, maybe ask a question or two. But first of all, I want to let the panelists, you know, do you have any reflections of what your colleagues have talked about? I'm sure you do, because you know, because again, you said all these great things out there. So I want to hear your reactions. I'll just let it be organic, and whoever wants to go first, please do.
Do you want to go, Sandra, or do you want me to go?
Rock, paper, scissors. No, I just wanted to say, you know, that's the danger and peril of going first is you never know what your colleagues are going to say. And so I find my colleagues were much more detailed in the initiatives than I was. I talked more generally, which is probably a great place to start. But the thing that struck me is, even though I didn't talk through all the details of the policies and the programs, hearing Dianne and Kim talk, in nursing, we have very similar parallels in terms of structures, in terms of making space, and you know, so I think that there is a synergy in terms of how we're addressing this across the different campuses and the different schools, excuse me, on our campus. And so there are actionable things that I think some great examples have been shown that really allow us to raise the importance and visibility of it.
Yeah, I think I'd echo Sandra. Is I don't recall, as a beginning academic, conversations about mental health or well-being. I think it was absent. I think when I was an academic in England, I think the analogy is the Cambridge students, they're like ducks on waters. They all look, they're really calm and their feet are just underneath. And I felt like sometimes there was this quietness in terms of the stresses. These are complex jobs in complex institutions. And what gives me optimism, I think, is the fact that these conversations are happening. They are explicit in our documents. There are ways, and it's not that, and I keep on saying it's, I think Jennifer in the chat room had something about, how do we deal with wellness when the root is student poverty? I think there are some difficult conversations that still be had, and we definitely don't want to say, as long as we think about wellness, we don't have to think about student, like there's no conflation there. But the fact that we've elevated and that people have, I liked your word, Sandra, permission to take breaks, that leaders are modeling wellness, which wasn't the case. I don't have the sense as an institution or as academic that you're always supposed to be writing a paper, or the person who was supposed to be writing from midnight to 4 a.m. For whatever reason. And I think that people are being more open and honest and saying, I think this is a really difficult, exciting, an exhausting kind of career. And if we want to sustain ourselves until our retirement age, then we have to embed wellness so that it's a joyful and, complex and joyful career that we're all have decided to choose. So I'll stop there.
I also had lots of thoughts listening to Sandra and Dianne, and to Sandra's point too. I was like, even being the third person, there was an element of, oh, I should have put different things in. And I had a workload thought where I was like, hey, I didn't know I could get away without doing slides. If I could have saved time and not done slides at all. But
that was why I did it. Honestly, it was to save me time and to build space for my own well-being so I could be here fully present.
Right? Oh, good. And then somebody gave me some positive reinforcement that the slides were helpful. So excellent. I'm glad. But there are things that I think have changed a lot. And I loved the points on the other slides around the informal practices and some things around like email practices. Like we in SSE have really started to live and breathe a culture around not emailing outside of business hours. It does actually mean I can tell my colleagues, some colleagues write their emails on the weekends and set the timer up, because sometimes I get a flood of emails at 8:30 on Monday morning. But that's a walk the talk kind of moment, right? And walking meetings is another one as well, where it's like, especially now that we've sort of got this flexibility, like this whole strange 2 years has resulted in, when we're going to do a meeting, is it one that we need to be face to face? Is it one that we can do over Zoom, or can we actually walk and get some exercise while we're doing it as well? So there's things like that are really the informal practices are something that are very, very profound. And I love this as well, the fact that we're all here together, actually having some conversations around it. The space to have conversations is a practice that I've also noticed where I've started to unlearn in my own self, sort of an addiction to productivity, where sometimes I'm in a meeting, and this actually happened to me more than once last week, where my brain, I know that we have an agenda, and then somebody comes through and actually starts by talking about something that is like really profound and challenging and difficult for them. And myself shifting as an engineer to actually feeling like, you know what, we can spend 15 or 20 minutes of this meeting holding space for somebody to talk about the stressors that they're having because their child is sick. Like, we can do that. We can spend 20 minutes doing that, and we're all actually very good at engineering. And so we can do our engineering action items in a little bit less time. Like, it's okay to do that. And so I think that there's a lot of beautiful informal things that are happening as well.
So, and I think you're highlighting a shift in our culture within, at our institution. But do you think this shift is reflected broadly in academic culture? Before, academic culture is focused on things like productivity, publishing, getting lots of grants, at the expense of, other things like well-being, right? So it takes a fine balance. Because academic culture does lead to many great things, right? Research, all the great findings, things that we have on today are due to, product of what we do on campus here. So how do we balance that? That productivity, but also to really understand the need to take care of ourselves.
Morag's comment in the chat room, I think, speaks to this. It's okay to slow down to speed up. I think I worry about the individuals that work 16 to 18-hour days. I think their brain, I can't imagine sustaining a pace, a level of cognitive ability, a level of tone and tact when you're that exhausted. I truly believe you can be more productive if you work hard. I'm not saying not to work hard for 8 hours, work hard for 8 or 9 hours, and then take the proper break. You will never, in all of our roles, all individuals across this campus, we will never finish the work. The work will always be there. But for 8 to 9 hours, you're productive, you work smart, you think better, you think with clarity, you write better, you're more professional, your tone and tact, all the things that give us consternation, that if the grievances, interpersonal challenges, a lot of it, not everything, that would be a superficial statement, but I hold on to a lot of his fatigue and people just kind of working always because of the sense of guilt. And when people literally take the breaks, I'm a firm believer. You need to take your breaks, work hard, then go home and then do something else. This is not our life. This is a really challenging, good job. And at the end of the day, you call it a day.
And Dianne, I'll just add, I absolutely agree. And the research supports what you're saying. It's not just a firm belief. It actually, we are, when we get, and sleep, don't get me started on sleep. I mean, sleep is one of those restorative things that helps build our resilience and buffer, the ebbs and flows of anxiety and how we manage stress gracefully or not, and all those sorts of things. So it is backed by evidence that, working yourself to the point of exhaustion at the point of, being productive is actually, it's counterintuitive. And I think Morag said it well, you slow down to speed up is, replenishing yourself so that you can give your best work, so that you have some energy left when you go home at the end of the day to give to your family and enjoy that time. So absolutely agree.
Yeah. And I think, another aspect of it too, is that sometimes like academics, we can be very highly productive. And so we can all have a bit of a tendency at times to bite off more than we can chew, or more than is healthy for us to chew at a time. And so even, from the teaching and learning lens, there's an aspect too of sometimes when I'm sitting and talking to academics, the advice is you don't need to do absolutely everything this year. Like there are times you're teaching a course and you've got a new course and you think, okay, and I've had these conversations, it's a new course and I want to try an active learning strategy and I want to do this and I want to, flip the labs and I want to, and it's also okay. It's okay to not do all of that this year, right? It's okay to sort of think about which is the one thing that I want to really give a shot this year, and then leave all the other things. So I think that choice of like, we don't all actually have to do absolutely everything. And, to Diane's point, yes, we still got to work hard. We've still got our jobs to do, but you don't have to do every single thing that everything on the wish list doesn't need to be completed to 100% that perfectionism that we can get to.
Yeah, as growing up as an academic or, going to grad school, it was drilled into us that we have to do these things. But, again, I'm hoping our conversation is changing, and this conversation here will lead to a shift in how we think about academics. Lots of great questions coming in for our panelists. Dianne, you mentioned, Indigenous practices and culture within, some of the slides that you said. Question is, would incorporating more Indigenous ceremony, gathering, and Indigenous ways of being and knowing help with embedding well-being at UCalgary?
Absolutely. And I think we've just scratched the surface. I think part of it is the humility and the humbleness in terms of how we need to learn better and think about, Indigenous practices in a way that is honoring and elevating Indigenous perspectives. So and I think we have to, so I think, again, that's the element of collective responsibility. We learn together on this journey and we think about the ways that make sense, that are authentic, that are meaningful, that's elevating Indigenous practices. So I think we still have a long way to go. I think that's part of our journey, but the acknowledgement that leaders are willing to do it and that so many faculty are willing to do it and students are increasingly wanting to learn more about it, I think that's just part of the maturity and the part of the journey in terms of how we do it well in a way that is authentic.
Any other thoughts on that specific point? Kim?
Yeah, I do not in any way, shape, or form profess to be an expert in it, but like the short answer is yes. And every new thing that I have learned, or like I've been to a handful of workshops or sharing circles on Indigenous ways of learning and being, and my experiences there I tend to keep just noticing that the things that come up are actually just best practices in teaching and learning and creating an environment for human beings to learn as well. And like there's one example, which is, like a sharing circle where we try and hear everyone's voices instead of a hierarchical structure of one person's talking and everybody else listens. And there is an element of that is, to me, part of a solution to the workload problem. Like as our classes get bigger, and as you get a professor that starts to be like, well, when I taught this 30 years ago, there was 20 students in the class. Now I have to figure out how to do it for 100. Getting into a system where we're able to let more people share their wisdom and learn from peers, and giving the student, like even if we could, this is going to sound like totally radical, but if we could shift our classrooms to be more conversation based, especially in engineering, it's a supportive learning environment where the students can start to learn more of the concepts from each other and help each other through more of things, which like utilizes our community, and that can start to reduce workload or the needs and the stressors to know everything and be the person that has to answer all of the questions. So it's just one example, but I find that everything that's come up for me in the Indigenous ways of knowing and learning and being just seems like helpful to the whole community.
Yeah, I absolutely agree with my colleagues in that, and I think there's a lovely note from Dianne in the chat here about, holistic well-being is that is that sense of connection and community, and having relationship with each other and honoring that instead of just the productivity and the outcomes. I think that's very helpful. And one thing I might just add in terms of people feeling comfortable bringing their whole selves to learning and work is the space that we're in, and is it welcoming, and are there things that people can identify within that space? And so a couple of years ago, we, in our Faculty of Nursing, we have some Indigenous students in nursing, and we had a director of Indigenous initiatives, and they were chatting, and one of the students said, we have this great student lounge, but I don't see anything here that's representative of my culture or my, my indigeneity. And sorry, I stumbled over that. And so we brought that to our campus faculty community, and we ended up getting some murals created by Indigenous artists that have really enlivened that space, and that people see their cultures and themselves represented in this, what can be a very, because our first floor is where we have all our learning labs and all the clinical simulation. It can be very sterile and very health related and not particularly relational. So those Indigenous murals have just changed it, I think, for everyone in that space. So I'll just add that as an example.
Again, great discussion here. Let's think a little bit about the pandemic. You know, the pandemic has changed how we work. We're discussing hybrid work here at UCalgary. I know all organizations are thinking about this. How does flexible work, working from home, does that play and contribute to well-being? And can we make that a part of it, especially within our academic environment here?
So the answer is yes, but there's a but. I think it's complex. I think as well, because it's notions of where people work are interconnected with other elements. So we're trying to balance out the flexibility in terms of, you know, the ability to work from home in terms of having a quiet space and to think deeply, to think critically, to not always be on or in an area. And that includes, well, again, every individual. There's also an element of relationality and what's the connection to other staff members, to other faculty, and to the students. And so what is the community that you're creating on a campus, of which we all contribute? And so I think there's that balance in terms of the individual element of either in terms of productivity. Some people think about as productivity of being able to work better or more efficiently at home. Other people might think about it as an element of self-care or flexibility given some of the demands from the home. But we have to balance it in terms of the requisite elements of what does a collective well-being look like for a campus culture. And so I think that's why I think as an institution, you know, I think it's actually really complex. And I think all sectors, both in the public and private, are grappling with it, because there's also a loss when there's too much flexibility or not having a team together in an area. And so trying to balance that out in a way in terms of recognizing how flexibility, trying to balance in terms of the individual needs within the flexibility and hybrid, and what some of the opportunities that have arisen and the silver linings, if there is any, from the pandemic, with also the collective well-being in terms of what does it mean to have those informal chats, to bump into the hallway, meeting for a coffee, seeing a student who might be in a distress, or a colleague that you may have not noticed on Zoom who might be struggling, and you know, we're not seeing those nonverbal cues to say, you know, how can I help? And so I think it's actually one that as a society we're grappling, not just within post-secondary institutions, but one that the public and private is saying, what does it look like in terms of our notion of connection and relationality? And can we figure out that right balance? And so I think those are the questions that are coming around in terms of how we do it purposefully and well.
Yeah, I absolutely agree, Dianne. And it's, you know, one thing as you were talking that I was thinking about in terms of the pandemic and, you know, the whole back in the first waves where it was like everything shut down, you will work from home. And that feeling of being constrained and you know, prisoner in our own home, if you will. And that's not just a work environment, that's like going out and getting groceries and everything. But now we're at this point in time where it feels like the world is opening up and there's a choice, right? And I think the choice is something that's very enabling and empowering, but we have to make those choices carefully, as you've said, Dianne, in terms of the balance between engagement and teams and high functioning teams and what that looks like across an organization, and how our individual choices weave into that. Because even though we make individual choices, we are a part of the culture of the organization. And so those two things are inseparable. And if we want to have that relationality and feel supported, we need to be out there. And I think there's a distinction here that's really important, being forced to work from home versus choosing when and how. And different people will have different answers because of, you know, some people's home environments are not a good work environment. And for others, I think through the pandemic, they've said, wow, this is great, but there's not one right answer, right? So and Dianne, I go back to those principles. What are the principles that as organizations we can work with that will allow those choices for people that is the right balance?
And I wholeheartedly agree with everything that's been said. And I think another thing that has opened up is it's been another place to have conversations, in that it, you know, like people are different, you know, to Sandra's point, people have different home environments. And so some people were like, get me back to the office. And some people are like, this really works well for me. And then the work is different, right? There are some things that go well online, and there are some things that don't go well online. And what I think this has done, and I think that a big part of a shift in culture, even, you know, like this, I think this relates to EDI kind of conversations, where the culture has shifted so that there is more of a tendency towards having conversations and trying to understand what an appropriate solution is in an appropriate place. And so, you know, there's flexibility, but flexibility doesn't necessarily mean everybody wake up this morning and pick and choose your own route, but it does, like, there's now more options. And so we're no longer in a place where it's just like, the default is you go to an office and you work 40 hours a week, you know, like that's the way that society works. We're now in a place where we can have more conversations around what's going to work and what's the right thing for this team and what's the right thing for you and what's the right thing based on your technology at home and what's the right, you know, how do we make things work in a new way, which I think is a very cool conversation.
Maybe, you know, we've having discussion, and it seems sounds like at least that the uptake is good from your faculties, but I'm curious about, you know, whether you've heard naysayers or challenges to this approach that you've been taking. You know, I've heard, you know, things like, you know, it's not my job to be, you know, to support well-being. You know, I'm an academic, right? I'm in engineering or whatever. I'm picking that for that. But you know, have you received any challenges, and how do you work or deal with those? You know, any thoughts or solutions for those in the audience?
I can start because you picked on engineering to start with. Yes. So, like, in short, yes, there's opposition, and more often than not, the bulk of the opposition has not been, oh my God, wellness is not important. Like, there aren't a lot of people that would say that wellness is massively unimportant and nobody should be doing it anywhere. The opposition has tended to be, it's not our job, or like, yeah, the students should be figuring it out on their own, or some, you know, like there's some conversations too around the words, like, oh yeah, like you're saying that stress is bad, but stress isn't always bad. And it's like, yeah, sure. Some, you know, and sometimes it can get bad, and sometimes it's a healthy level of stress. Like but so there are people that can get defensive around, you know, they've come up with their own strategies for coping. So the strategy that we've kind of been taking is around, I'd say, sort of general change management, where there are people that immediately are feeling like, yes, this is fantastically important, but I don't know what to do. And so I've connected with some professors that feel like, I would love to be doing something in my classroom, but I don't know what to do. And so in connecting with those, then there's an education opportunity, right? And there's an opportunity to, here's some materials you can use in your classroom. So and then there are some people that say, okay, it's maybe important, but it's not my job. And then that's okay. So then I don't necessarily need to force people to be doing something that they feel like isn't their job, but we can identify the people that are kind of change leaders and champions and are really aligned with it. And over the years, more and more people are starting to see things. Like, I'll tell one story with a professor that was probably in the camp of like, sure, this is important, but it's not my job. He still let us in for a classroom visit. And then in that classroom visit, there was a reaction that said, oh my God, I thought you were here for the students, but that thing that you just presented on completely applies to me. And so I used the technique for 2 minutes, and the response ended up being, you should actually present that same thing at Engineering Faculty Council, right? Because it's people. So in some ways, it's sort of just being patient and showing up and doing the work.
I was trying to hold the 5 seconds, but I only got to 3, Sandra. I thought because I always...
that's good. Hey, you know what? You're going in the right direction, Diane.
So I think, you know, there's some similarities to Kim. You know, some of the tensions, the nervousness of the emphasis of well-being, that it tends to be individualist. Some people perceive it anyways as that, and it's not addressing the root causes such as poverty or workload or budget or things. And so there's a nervous that if we only talk about well-being, we're not talking about the other the issues at the root of it. And I think that's a fair issue in terms of people perceive the conflation. There's others, a cynicism in terms of self-care. Our work is not about yoga. So you'll get the cynical elements. We're here to work, and if you need to do self-care, do it at home. And so there's still more of a traditional stance, I think, in that one. And also the resources and time allocated to talking about it when we could be talking about other things. And so in terms of the distribution of time, or to put it in a strategic plan or not, and what does that look like in terms of then the commitments we make over 5 years, then that's always a conversation of could we be allocating resources differently. And so those are the ones, but the biggest one is actually kind of the well-being as a notion of that we're suppressing the more complex issues that might be underpinning one's well-being. I'm not compelled by that argument, but I do acknowledge it. I think part of it is as leaders to be explicit, is saying well-being's here's what we can control in terms of internal variables. Here are the things that are contributing to lack of wellness that I acknowledge, but I'm not sure if I can redress because it's beyond our control. And so I think part of it is being explicit and saying, I acknowledge this is an issue. I acknowledge that managers had not had salary increases for 8 years. That is something beyond something that's not within our control, but I have to acknowledge that's contributing to their lack of wellness, or lack of, so I think part of it is being attentive, support staff saying, well, my wellness would go up if I had less hours from 35 to 20. Well, that's beyond our control. So just making those distinctions really clear in terms of here's what's possible with the well-being versus what isn't, and I think ensuring that we're not throwing things underneath the rug in other ways. I think just being honest of the limitations of well-being and what it can do as well.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, well said, Dianne. And I think, people obviously, they look at nursing and they say, oh, well, of course, nursing is doing this because you're nurses and you care for people and you're all about that, compared to, the other stereotype, which might be Kim's faculty, which is you have a different focus. And I will tell you, it's even more important, not even more, but in nursing, there's an element of selflessness, I think, and there's this socialization that we have to care for others before ourselves, and that's not healthy either, right? And so and you look at every day in the news and social media, nursing burnout, emergency rooms are closing because people are just done. I mean, this is really, really seriously important in healthcare, and first and foremost, we need to care for ourselves, or we're not going to have enough healthcare providers out there. And so I think about that every day as we're thinking about what our role is as a post-secondary that's educating healthcare providers. First and foremost is caring for ourselves. And it's the same thing in education and social work and medicine as well. That this is an essential skill. Is helping our students early on to develop habits of self-care, what that means for them. Giving them tools and options to try, so that they're not just not doing it or thinking that they need to suck it up. I think the days of that are gone, thankfully, and we have open space for conversations about why it's important. So it's not just a slam dunk in nursing, and we do have those that there's very skeptical, and language like mindfulness or meditation. Some people are very that just sets them off because they equate it with a religious practice or something, and so unpacking what those words mean, I think, as Kim and Dianne were saying, is really, really important, and creating a menu of opportunities. Not everything is going to resonate with everyone, but putting it out there as a conversation, and a little a menu board of these are things, strategies to try, and word of mouth, like, hey, this worked for me, it might work for you, and making space for that, I think is really important. And I think there's more between our faculties that we can share than makes us different, right? And I think that's just the conversation today has really shown that.
Yeah, and I can reflect on what our last discussion here. I think it's engaging people. To engage people, you have to meet them where they're at, right? And if we can build resources, services, programs to meet where they're at, that might engage people to see further and get further help. Wow, such a great discussion. We're at time. We can go on for hours. I would go on for hours to talk about. I know we're ending 1 minute. I would like to thank our panelists here today and the audience for joining us. And so this really concludes our 2022 summer wellness series. On behalf of the Taylor Institute for Teaching and Learning and the Campus Methodology Strategy, I want to thank you all for joining us today. Again, a big final thanks to Sandra, Dianne, Kim for such a wonderful discussion.